and Vice Chairman Leahy for negotiating a bipartisan compromise that will keep the government's doors open. Neither side got everything they wanted. That's why it's called a compromise. But in the end, fully funding the government and keeping it open is what's best for the American people. What we saw during the 35-day government shutdown was that it took a terrible toll on our federal workers, and it cost the U.S. economy $11 billion, including $3 billion that's gone forever, according to the Congressional Budget Office. Across the country, federal workers have been very anxiously waiting to see if we were going to come to an agreement, if they were going to be. Failure to do so would once again deprive Americans of important government services and throw our economy into a tailspin. So I urge all of our colleagues in Congress to take up this funding legislation, to pass it, and the President to sign it as soon as it reaches his desk. Protecting our borders should not be an exercise in partisanship, and I'm glad to see that this bill supports common sense investments that focus on the technology, infrastructure, and personnel that are needed to deprive Americans of borders to provide actual security that works. The bill provides $1.375 billion for targeted fencing in vulnerable areas along the southern border, and more than $800 million for Border Patrol agents, better surveillance, and screening technologies, and increased security at our ports of entry. When resourced and deployed appropriately, these types of smart investments are far more likely to interrupt the flow of narcotics than a costly and ineffective border wall. Importantly, the legislation also includes $77 million for opioid equipment and staffing to interdict fentanyl and other synthetic opioids that are shipped through international mail and express consignment facilities. And this is particularly important to states like mine, New Hampshire, where we have the second highest overdose death rate from opioids in the country. And so many of those deaths are caused by the synthetic fentanyl. The opioid epidemic is a true national emergency, and federal investments like these are what's needed to stop the illegal flow of these drugs into the country. Now, when Congress takes up and passes this deal, it will not only pass the appropriations bill for the Department of Homeland Security, but also 6 other appropriations bills that have unfortunately been waylaid by our shutdown. This appropriations package supports critical federal investments across all government agencies, and I want to highlight just a few of those, starting with the programs funded in the bipartisan Commerce, Justice, and Science and Related Agencies Appropriations Bill for the fiscal year 2019. As ranking member of the CJS subcommittee, I worked closely with my colleague, Senator Moran from Kansas, who chairs the subcommittee, and we crafted what I believe is a truly bipartisan bill that will promote the economy, protect the American people, and secure our nation's leadership in science and innovation. For example, the fiscal year 19 CJS bill provides $468 million in dedicated Justice Department grant programs to tackle the opioid epidemic. The legislation will provide funding to state and local governments and those organizations working on the front lines, providing a balanced approach of law enforcement, treatment, and recovery resources to help our communities who are dealing with opioid and fentanyl deaths. This amount is $21 million higher than the FY18 level and $336 million higher than the President's budget request. For communities desperately fighting the opioid addiction, any further delay in funding is dangerous and could be deadly. So it's critical that we pass this bill today. Importantly, the legislation also contains the highest funding level ever for the Office of Violence Against Women, $497.5 million for critical programs that provide training for police officers and prosecutors, rape prevention programs, and funding for women's shelters. While I'm glad that the appropriations package provides funding for these Violence Against Women Act programs, more work needs to be done to better support survivors of domestic and sexual violence. I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to address the complex issue of domestic violence. Now, the appropriations package also supports investments in our national infrastructure and provides more than $49 billion to the Federal Highway Administration to modernize our highways and repair our bridges. This legislation would also provide a $1.3 billion increase for housing programs like rental assistance and homeless support services. And for us in New Hampshire, that means that 9,500 low-income households will continue to have a place that they can call home. I'm pleased that the appropriations package includes a 1.9% pay increase for federal civilian employees. This is a cost of living increase that is long overdue. You know, during the shutdown, I had a chance to meet with a number of our federal workers. And one of the things that impressed me the most was the dedication that those workers had to their jobs and to serving the people of this country. They were going to work without getting paid, without knowing when they were going to get paid. And yet they showed up every day because of their commitment to the people of this country. Now, in addition to passing the appropriations package, Congress should take further action to provide financial security to federal employees and contractors. And we just heard our colleague Tina Smith talking about the importance of providing the pay to those people who so far are not slated to get back pay. I've co-sponsored legislation to secure back pay for the federal contractor employees, including janitorial, food, and security services workers who were furloughed or forced to accept reduced work hours as a result of the shutdown. I hope that we in Congress will take up and pass the bills that Senator Smith outlines as soon as possible. Now, Mr. President, I know you know this because we've talked about it. But Americans are tired of partisanship. They expect their elected officials to work together, to come to a bipartisan compromise, and to do what's good for the country. And I couldn't agree more. The Senate will soon consider an appropriations package to supply federal investments for programs that support national defense, small businesses, conservation of public lands, food assistance for low-income families, and so much more. This is a package that also includes compromise proposals to improve our border security. I hope we will pass this package this afternoon and that the President will sign this legislation into law as soon as it passes the House. Federal workers are dedicated to serving the American people, and they have families to care for. They should never again be used as pawns. We should never again use shutting down the federal government as an excuse over disagreements around policy issues. It is time for us as elected leaders to move away from this partisan politics to live up to the expectations of our constituents. Let's fund the government, and let's do it today. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Thank you. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
All right, folks, welcome. My name is Jen. I'm from Golden State Times. I'm the host of the stream. I'd like to thank you for choosing us as your stream of choice. So today they're going to be voting on the nomination of the new Attorney General, William Barr. So make sure you guys stay tuned. That's going to be happening in just a few minutes. It's scheduled to happen in a few minutes. But you guys know how the Senate is and how government is in general, where they say one thing and then, something else happens or whatever. But it is on the schedule. It hasn't been changed. It's going to happen in just a few minutes. And make sure you guys stay tuned.
Mr. President.
Oh, here we go.
I ask consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection. The question is on the Barr nomination.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman.
Yes.
Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul. Gotcha. Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Bozeman, Cornyn, Crapo, Graham, Isaacson, Thune, and Young. Senators voting in the negative: Booker, Carper, Rosen, Schatz, Shaheen, Smith, Stabenow, Warren, and Whitehouse. Mrs. Fisher. Yes. Aye. Mrs. Feinstein. No. Mr. Sanders. No. Mr. Kennedy. Aye. Mr. Hawley. Aye. Mr. Paul. No. Mr. Romney. Aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Aye.
So Romney voted yes and Paul voted no. Is it Rand Paul? If anybody knows, let me know.
Mr. Scott of Florida. Aye. Mr. Perdue. Aye. Ms. Duckworth. No. Mr. Bennett? No. Mr. Kramer? Aye. Ms. McSally? Aye. Ms. Harris? No. Mr. Toomey? Aye. Mr. Tillis? Aye. Mr. Braun? Aye. Mr. Tester? No. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Casey? No. Mr. Roberts? Aye. Mr. Jones? Mr. Jones, aye. Ms. Cinema? Aye.
All right, folks. So Democrat Senator from Arizona Cinema voted yes on William Barr.
A lot of nice red up here today.
Mr. Alexander? Aye. Mr. Menendez? No. Mr. Kane? No. Mr. Hoven. Aye. Mr. Sass. Aye. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Reed, no. Ms. Ernst, aye. Ms. Hassan, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. King, no. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye.
All right, folks, really quickly, if you haven't yet, please share the live stream on social media. That helps us out a lot. Also,
Ms.
don't forget
Collins,
to
aye.
click the thumbs up button.
Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Udall, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Gardner, aye. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Coons, Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Rubio, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye.
All right, folks, to everyone that is asking, they cannot stop the vote until everyone has voted. And that's the Senate rules. Also, they can change their vote after everybody voted. So just in case you were wondering how it worked, that's how it is. Everyone has to vote. Every single senator has to vote or put a no vote in until that happens. Then it will be done.
Mr. Durbin? No. Mr. Leahy? No. Mr. Blunt, aye.
All right, folks. So we're going to give a little bit of a background on how this confirmation works for those that don't know. If you know, then perfect. But there is some people that don't know how this works. All right. So traditionally, it's required a supportive of 60 yes votes of 100 senators. However, there are some rules that have changed. If you use the nuclear option, then you need 51 votes in most cases. The only exception is for a Supreme Court justice vote. So if there is a tie between yes and no's on the Senate floor for a confirmation, then the vice president is the one that casts the deciding vote. In this situation, as you can see, it's 54 to 38. You need 60 votes in order for the nomination to go through. If there was a tie, then the vice president will come in and he will be the 51st vote. In other instances, if they can't find enough votes, then they have to do the nuclear option, which will mean it needs a 51 vote majority in order for the nomination to go through. So he needs 6 more votes, 6 more yes votes in order for William Barr to become the next Attorney General of the United States.
Mrs. Gillibrand, no.
All right, folks, I would like to give a quick shout out to Marvin. Marvin says, let's see here, it says, what is a tie at this point? No, there's no tie right now, Marvin. 54 to 39. We're just waiting for 6 more votes, 6 more yes votes to be able to, for Mr. Barr to be able to be confirmed. So Mr. Barr is waiting for 6 votes, folks, for a new attorney general. All right, so the press secretary just a few seconds ago, or 17 minutes ago, actually said that that we have a new attorney general, William Barr, that he has been confirmed. But what she means is that they know, I guess, within the White House that they have enough votes to get to 60. I think that is what that tweet represents. On the Senate floor, they still haven't confirmed him. As you guys can see, the roll call vote is still going on. The president of the Senate at this point hasn't said or hasn't given the numbers of yes and no votes. So until that happens, he will be fully confirmed. So I think the press secretary is just saying that they think that they have enough votes to confirm him, but the Senate hasn't done it themselves. So we have to wait for that. Hey, Gorf, how's it going, brother? I hope you're still there. Thank you so much for your support, Gorf. You know, you always have a band hammer here with us, brother, if you want to, if you're interested. I don't know if you're just passing by and stuff like that, but if it's the real Gorf, let me know, bro. Like, get a hold of me and hopefully we can talk. Welcome back if it is you, Gorf.
Ms. Baldwin? No. Ms. Klobuchar? No. Mr. Wyden? No. Mr. Peters? No.
I just want to give a quick thank you to Card Collector. Thank you so much for your support through Super Chat. And Card Collector says, thank you for doing this. Just subbed. Well, welcome to the family, Card Collector. And anybody else that likes our coverage and sees this as
Ms.
useful,
Hirono?
then subscribe.
No.
I want to give a quick thank you to Shelva Whipke. Thank you so much for your support through Super Chat. All of those Super Chats helps us immensely and makes us better. So thank you so much for your continued support.
Mr. Markey? No.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, the yeas are 54, the nays are 45. Nomination is confirmed.
Mr. President,
The senator for Arkansas.
I ask unanimous consent that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to legislative session for a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I have 4 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, it's no secret that the 116th Congress got off to a rocky start as we tried to address the ongoing partial shutdown. Despite that, I remain optimistic that we can work together to get things done for the American people. Those looking for an example on how to find common ground should look no further than the important work Congress has done and continues to do for our veterans. The Senate Veterans Affairs Committee's hearing room is traditionally one of the most bipartisan places in Washington, and it's also one of the busiest. Last Congress, under Chairman Isaacson's leadership, we held 30 hearings, considered 56 pieces of legislation, and sent 17 of President Trump's nominees to serve our veterans to the full Senate. That spirit of cooperation continued here on the floor. During the last session of Congress, the Senate passed 23 major pieces of veterans-related legislation. As a result, the President signed into law bills that significantly enhance health care, education, retirement, and other benefits for our veterans. I want to talk briefly about 2 of the more notable measures, the VA Mission Act and the Forever GI Bill, to underscore why it's so important for Congress to operate in a collaborative manner. Bipartisan oversight of the departments and agencies that implement the laws we pass in this chamber is critical to ensuring the executive branch follows the intent of Congress. These 2 laws highlight just how important that is. Let's start with the VA Mission Act. This law was passed to replace the Veterans Choice Act, which was created in response to the VA Health Administration scandal of 2014. This was a good first step. The Choice program addressed many shortcomings within the VA system. However, my colleagues and I quickly learned it had its own share of troubles. Specifically, we heard repeated stories of difficulties navigating the complex and confusing bureaucratic process. And despite the new reforms, many veterans were still facing unacceptably long wait times at VA medical centers. Through our oversight of the Choice program, we recognized that more had to be done to strengthen and streamline VA healthcare services and its community care programs. That was the genesis of the VA Mission Act. One of the key reforms in the VA Mission Act is that it enables veterans to seek quality health care services in their own communities, whether inside the VA system or from a private sector provider. Specifically, the law requires the department to establish access and quality standards that will be used as the framework of the VA and the veteran to decide when to get care in a VA facility and when to get care in the community. If the VA is unable to meet certain designated access standards, veterans will be given the option to receive care in the community. Last week, the VA announced the proposed new access standards to determine a veteran's eligibility for the community care that will take effect this June. I'm pleased that the VA maintained the spirit of the law in its proposed access standards. We understood that providing additional access to community health care resources, there would be an added cost. As chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee that has jurisdiction over the VA, I will be closely working, the entire committee will be closely working with the department, and my colleagues together will ensure that we have the responsibility of making sure that the allocation of resources to support veterans' health care are spent wisely. Oversight is also crucial to uncover negligence on the part of the agencies charged with implementing the law. This is exactly what happened when the VA failed to fully comply with the housing stipend rates set by the Forever GI Bill. Passage of the initial GI Bill after World War II was seen as a turning point in the way our nation treated those who served. The program was designed to give servicemen and women the building blocks they needed to succeed after leaving the military. The problem is those building blocks have changed in the 70-plus years since the GI Bill was first instituted. Since then, Congress modernized the GI Bill when it passed the post-9/11 GI Bill. After 17 years of war, it was once again time for an update. The Harry W. Comrie Veterans Educational Assistance Act, also known as the Forever GI Bill, brings educational benefits to veterans so that they can receive them in this modern era. It became apparent, however, that the VA was implementing key provisions of the law incorrectly. When Secretary Wilkie testified before the VA committee last September, I pressed him about the department's failure to fully award the housing allowances for more than 340,000 Forever GI Bill beneficiaries. According to the statute, the VA should have used the Department of Defense's 2018 basic allowance for housing rates. This should have been calculated based on the zip code where the student takes the majority of classes rather than on the zip code.
All right, folks. So we just got confirmation that William Barr is going to be sworn in at the White House. But according to the press secretary, at this moment, they're trying to see if they're going to open it up to the press. So we're going to shut down this live stream to see if we're going to be able to get footage of them swearing in William Barr, or if they're going to make an event out of it with the President of the United States. It's not really confirmed at this point, but we have to get ready for it just in case. So thank you so much for choosing Golden State Times as your stream of choice. And also thank you to everyone that has been sharing the live stream on social media, on Facebook and Twitter and stuff like that. That helps out the channel so much, folks. You cannot believe how much that helps us. Every single time that you guys, watch one of our videos and share it, every single time that you guys share the live streams and give them a thumbs up and stuff like that, that helps out the channel so much. That's what keeps us alive here at Golden State Times. But if you are new to the channel and you found our coverage interesting, entertaining, and also informative, then make sure that you guys subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell. If you also want to sign up to our notification squad, is basically what I call it, all you have to do is send me a text message with the word America First to 555-888. Again, send me a text message with the word America First to 555888. And that way we notify you directly from here at Golden State Times instead of YouTube, because I know YouTube sometimes doesn't send notifications. So that's why we have a notification system that we send the notification directly to you. Again, all you have to do is send the word America First to 555888. Also, don't forget to check out our website, folks. We do have a website. We cover everything in politics, the White House, everything. So make sure you guys go and check it out. It's goldenstatetimes.com. Again, that's goldenstatetimes.com. 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 Make sure you guys bookmark it and check it out, because we have tons of articles that are going to be posted on there of news of the day and stuff like that. Stuff that we don't cover here on the channel on YouTube. but we cover it on our website. So we keep you guys up to date on everything that is going on within politics, the president, the White House, State Department, everything that you guys can possibly think of. We cover it on both on our website, goldenstatetimes.com, and here on the channel on YouTube. So make sure you guys go and check it out. Thank you so much for choosing Golden State Times as your stream of choice. And we hope that we get footage, and we hope that they allow the press to come into the place where William Barr is going to be sworn in. So make sure you guys stay tuned. There might be a live stream coming up or a video coming up soon. So stay tuned for that. Thank you very much for choosing Golden State Times as your stream of choice, and I'll see you soon. Peace.